Thank you, Anna. Thank you all so much for joining me and taking the time to learn a little bit more about stalking today. As many of you know, January is National Stalking Awareness Month, and of course we want to spread awareness and education about stalking all year round, but it's also great to start 2020 off right with a real focus on this important issue. So thank you all so much for taking the time to learn a little more with me this afternoon. SPARK is a project of Equitas, and it's funded by the Office of Violence Against Women. We have our website, stalkingawareness.org. Unfortunately, it is down at the moment for the first time ever during National Stalking Awareness Month, so that's really unfortunate, but it'll be back up again soon. In the meantime and beyond, you can follow us on social media. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and our handle there is at Follow Us Legally. So before I get into the content today, I'd love to have a sense of who was able to join. So you can let me know, and Anna, if you can bring up that poll, what discipline here do you most closely identify with? Of course, we know it takes a whole collective community response to address domestic violence, sexual violence, and stalking. So I really appreciate all of your work and the role that you play. And if you're in that other category, you can go ahead and type in the chat box what discipline would better describe you, just so I know who is able to join. So I'll give you a few more seconds to fill that out. Title IX coordinator, yeah, our campus folks, great. And we do a lot of trainings for campuses, so definitely reach out to us. Okay, so it looks like we have, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. A lot of victim advocates, DVNSA program staff, some more Title IX and campus folks, some law enforcement. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. And another question, how many of you have had the opportunity to attend a training specifically on the topic of stalking before today? So is this your first training? You've been to maybe one training, or oh boy, I could lead this. So any of those. Give you a few more seconds. Okay, so we have a few folks who have been to several trainings, which is great, but it looks like about almost half of you are saying this is my first stalking training, and over a third are saying maybe I've had one or two stalking trainings. So, you know, I appreciate you sharing that, and that's really, really typical, where even seasoned professionals in the field haven't always had the opportunity to attend a training on stalking. And as you may recall, there's 4 major crimes under the Violence Against Women Act. It's sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. It's always that and stalking, right, that can sometimes be sort of relegated to an afterthought in our field. And I think that by the end of this webinar, you'll see, if you don't already, that you definitely are already working with stalking victims, survivors, and offenders with the essential work that you're doing, but you may not be looking at them that way because we're so undertrained on stalking. So I hope that by the end of this session, we're moving that and stalking to the beginning of the sentence, and you can kind of view your work through that lens a little bit. So why talk about stalking besides it's Stalking Awareness Month, it's one of the 4 crimes? Well, stalking is a really critical thing to understand. It is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. So stalking is criminal. It is a crime at the federal level in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and U.S. territories. It's a crime in tribal lands and in the military justice system. It might be a misdemeanor or a felony depending on the jurisdiction and the situation, but it is a crime everywhere in America. And a lot of folks don't realize that. And so we have victims saying, what am I going to do? Call the police because some guy's, you know, texting me? Well, if it's part of a stalking course of conduct, then yes, because stalking is a crime and there is something we can do about it. And stalking is traumatic. So a lot of times when we talk about why it's so essential to identify and respond to stalking, we go right to that co-occurrence with physical violence and lethality. And that is really important. I'll get to it in just a couple of slides. But I want to pause before and also note that stalking is a crime because even if it does not co-occur or predict physical violence or lethality, it is a terrible and traumatic crime in its own right that can have lifelong impacts on victims and survivors. So many stalking victims experience mental health issues that can be quite severe. 1 in 8 lose time from work, with more than half lose 5 days of work or more. And stalking victims are typically not a protected class of worker. So their employer, it's the employer's discretion if they want to accommodate the victim or not, right? And that can have more financial consequences. And relocate. And this really shocked me when I learned this, that 1 in 7 stalking victims move as a result of the stalking behavior. So think about how annoying it is to move when you want to move, right? To pack up your things and your family and get the movers and all of that when you've chosen to relocate. We have 1 in 7 stalking victims making that choice as a result of their victimization. So I think it really goes to show just how consuming and traumatic this crime can be. Always helpful to hear from survivors in their own words. This is a survivor's quote. She said, "It's not easy to describe the fear you have when you see the stalker or signs of the stalker everywhere you go. I have given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I will be looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there." I think it's a powerful quote, and it's very typical of stalking victims because stalkers can be quite persistent. They create a sense that they're always there and won't give up, and sometimes that really is the case. I've talked to plenty of stalking victims who say, you know, I knew the day that his parole ended, the day that he got out of jail, he'd call me, and he did. So it's something that can really have lifelong impact. And of course, stalking is dangerous. It often co-occurs with physical assault and sexual violence, including but not limited to rape. 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or harm their victims, and in 76% of intimate partner femicides, so that's murder of a female partner, in 76% of completed and 85% of attempted femicides, there was stalking in the year prior to that attack. So stalking is one of those things that we want to pay attention to early. Because it's really, as this researcher said, stalking is homicide in slow motion. So, of course, stalking does not always lead to physical violence or homicide, but when you take a look back at these cases, typically it started with text messages following on those behaviors that sometimes get dismissed because no one's been hurt yet. It's one of the few crimes where early intervention can prevent violence and even death. So we definitely want to be taking those early stalking behaviors very seriously and identifying them as soon as we can. And yet, similar to sexual violence and domestic violence, stalking is severely underreported. So less than 40% report to law enforcement, and that's for a variety of reasons. They may not recognize what's going on is a crime. They may not realize that's even an option to report to law enforcement. They may not realize that they may not trust law enforcement to respond appropriately or take them seriously. They might feel they lack evidence. They might be minimizing the situation and saying, oh, it's not such a big deal, I can handle this. There's a variety of reasons why they might not report. But even when they do report, stalking is very undercharged. So this was a small domestic violence crime study in the Denver area, and they found about 1,800 cases of domestic violence. Almost 300 involved stalking, about 1 in 6. How many of these cases, and you can go ahead and type in the chat box, how many do you think were charged as stalking in this study, were actually charged as a stalking crime? We have 3, 0, 5. Okay, yeah, some people, 50. So some people are even more pessimistic than the reality, and some of you are a little more optimistic. It was 1. 1 case was actually charged as stalking, even when law enforcement had everything they needed to charge that. And so it's not to single out law enforcement in any way. It's just that it's so undertrained in our field. It's hard to get to the point when all that evidence is there. And even when it is, it's severely, severely undercharged. But of course, we're going to change that. So by understanding stalking, recognizing it, and building a better coordinated community response that includes stalking. So I keep saying stalking's so bad, we have to do something. What exactly is stalking? So I'm going to present you with a few scenarios. First, I want to say, though, that with stalking, there's the behavioral definition and a legal definition. So we're going to go through the behavioral definition today, and that's for a few reasons. One is that you're joining from all over the country, which is wonderful, and of course, every state has their own statute about stalking, so it can vary quite a bit from state to state, but I'm happy to talk to you further about your state statute if you want to reach out after the webinar. But even when I'm only presenting to one state, I always think it's important to focus on that behavioral definition, because that gives us a better sense of what stalking really is and what stalkers really do to help us identify what's going on. So behaviorally, I have 3 scenarios for you, and I'd like you to vote, do you think this is stalking, yes or no? So all of these scenarios are going to be behaviors we don't like. Okay, they're all negative behaviors, but are they stalking? So Anna, if you can pull up that first poll to that effect. Let's say a student hides a camera in the women's locker room to watch the women undress. It goes undiscovered for months. Again, we don't like it no matter what, but does that sound like stalking, yes or no? I'll give you a few seconds to respond. Okay, it looks like we split the room on that one. About a third are saying, yes, that's stalking, and a little over, about 2/3 are saying, no, that's not stalking. Okay, next scenario. And then, of course, I'll go over these at the end. An ex-partner repeatedly spreads vicious rumors about their former partner on social media. Does that sound like stalking, yes or no? I'll give you a few seconds to fill that out. Okay, very split. Looks like about half and half are saying, yes, that's stalking. No, that's not stalking. Okay? And last but not least, there's a supervisor who's just terrible, regularly asks her employee personal questions, mocks him in meetings, sends emails at odd hours, is verbally abusive when he doesn't respond right away. Does that sound like stalking to you? Yes or no? Again, I'll give you a few seconds to fill that out. Okay, so again, a very split room, about 50-50. Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for doing that. So when you were answering these questions, you might have been thinking to yourself, okay, well, this is bad, but is it necessarily stalking? Does it have to be more than one incident? Does it have to be directed at a specific person, or could it be for however many women walk by the camera or whatever? So luckily for you, I'm going to answer those questions right now by going through the behavioral definition of stalking and bringing those scenarios back in. So behaviorally, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So it is a pattern of behavior. It is not a single incident or a one-off event, and that's called the course of conduct in most stalking statutes. So throughout today's session, you might hear me kind of use those terms interchangeably, pattern of behavior, course of conduct. I'm really talking about the same thing, and in most, if not all statutes, that's 2 incidents or more. So 2 or more makes that pattern. And the behaviors can be quite varied. So let's say I'm stalking Anna because I'm the worst presenter ever. Okay, so maybe Monday, I text her all day. Tuesday, I get angry she didn't respond. I smash her windows. Then Wednesday, I feel guilty about that, so I send her flowers. All of those are stalking behaviors, even though some of them, like sending texts or sending gifts, would not be criminal outside the context of a stalking case. Those behaviors can become criminal in the context of a stalking situation. So a lot of times stalkers combine behaviors that are crimes on their own, for example, property damage, vandalism, right? And I could call just that in. But what I'll encourage you to do throughout this webinar is when we see an incident like that property damage, to take a step back and see what else is going on here, both other crimes committed by the same offender and other behaviors that may not be criminal but could become criminalized as part of that stalking course of conduct. So a lot of times stalkers are doing both of those things. So it's a pattern of behavior. It's directed at a specific person. So with that first scenario with the locker room and the hidden camera, that might still be a crime. But it's not stalking necessarily because it's not directed at a specific person. That offender put the camera in the locker room and any woman who happened to come by became a victim, right, became recorded by that camera. Now, it could become a stalking case. Let's say that same offender identifies women from the video, does some research, contacts them online, and says, you better XYZ or else I will release the photos. Okay, now we could be looking at, you know, voyeurism, non-consensual distribution of images, and extortion and stalking, right? We could be looking at all of those. But just the act, and I don't say just to minimize it, still criminal, but the sole act of placing that camera is not stalking because it's not directed at a specific person. That being said, we do often see in stalking cases what we call target dispersion, which is perhaps the ex-partner is stalking their ex, the victim, and then their victim starts seeing someone new romantically. So now we have a stalker targeting their ex-partner and the ex's new significant other, right? And certainly a stalker might reach out to a victim's family, friends, coworkers, colleagues, others, but it's in the context and purpose of reaching that one individual. They're doing it to gather information about, pursue, and contact that victim. So that's what makes it directed at a specific person. And it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So fear is really essential to the definition of stalking, and it's actually what separates stalking from a crime it's often confused with, which is harassment. So harassment is more like that last scenario with a terrible employer, right? And so harassment typically is repeated behavior that would make somebody, a victim, feel angry, annoyed, frustrated, and harassment can be quite serious. I'm not trying to belittle that in any way, but it's not necessarily scary. So if my supervisor is texting me at all hours, berating me verbally in meetings, I might be like, wow, this is the worst, right? Like, I feel really disrespected, I feel angry, I should definitely go to HR about that. But I'm not necessarily afraid of her. Now, let's say she starts following me home, she's texting my husband, I don't know how she got the number, she's sending me a picture of myself walking my dog saying, why are you doing that instead of working? Okay, that's scary now, right? And so harassment can be part of a stalking course of conduct, and harassment can become stalking. But a lot of times we use the word harassment when we mean stalking, and I see it misused all the time. You know, I'll read an article that says, she received 60 death threats, it was extreme harassment. I don't know about you, but when I get my death threats, I'm not just annoyed, I'm scared, right? So that's really what makes it stalking. That reasonable person would feel fear. But fear is challenging as a concept because fear is very personal, right? What's scary to me may not be scary to you, and vice versa. So we're going to watch, this is literally a 5-second video. I want you to think about which of these folks you identify with more. So Anna, if you could pull that up. I'm not seeing it. No, Anna, if you could pull up the video. Okay, that's the whole thing. So apologies to people who don't like spiders. So you can tell me in the chat box, actually by raising your hands, you can do that at the top. How many of you identify more with the woman in that video? Okay, I'm seeing a few people. Or you can go ahead and type in the chat box. I'm actually not seeing the hands raised. Yeah, some people are saying, yep, screaming girl, that's me. I understand that. You know, how many are like, we're moving, burn the house down, right? Who here identifies more with the man in that video who's kind of giving her this, like, are you kidding me sort of face? Okay, so we see a little bit of both, right? And most of us, even if you really hate, is anyone the spider? I'm just kidding. So exactly. So someone said, man, it's just a spider. Right, so if you didn't see the video, essentially, there's a man and woman hanging out on the couch, a tiny spider approaches, and this woman absolutely panics, shrieks, jumps up, and the man looks at her like, what is wrong with you? So most of us can understand where this guy's coming from, right? So even if we really don't like spiders. And it can look like this woman's really overreacting. But let's say I give you a little more information. So let's say you learn that last year, this woman was bitten by a spider that looked just like that, and she had a terrible allergic reaction, went to the hospital, and almost died. now her reaction seems a little bit more reasonable, right? Hopefully we're not anymore saying to her, hey, it's just a spider, calm down, right? Because now you have that context, you have that backstory, and it makes sense why she's having that reaction. And that's really critical. Context is so critical in stalking cases. It's really everything in stalking cases. Because sometimes what seems scary to a victim may not seem scary to an outsider at all. It might seem benign or even nice. Like, for example, this was a case where a woman called the police. She's hysterical. And all she would say was, there's a cup of coffee in my car. So understandably, the police aren't like sending out the SWAT team. You know, they're kind of like, you prefer tea? Like, what is your problem? Eventually, she calms down enough and says, he's here. So it turned out this was a stalking victim, had been abused by an ex-boyfriend, had relocated, address confidentiality, the whole thing, really thought she'd covered her tracks. She leaves to go to work that morning. She gets in her car. There's a cup of coffee with his old nickname for her on it. So I can't see or hear you, unfortunately, because we're on a webinar, but typically when I tell that story, people make a sad, kind of noise. And a kind of shake their head sort of face, right? And that's a reasonable person would feel fear. When we hear the whole story, when we get that context, we can understand why that cup of coffee was so scary. But if all we hear is there's coffee in the car, we're like, what's the big deal? These cars of coffee now? That sounds amazing. I would love my car to come with coffee in the morning, right? So it's really easy to dismiss those victim concerns until we know the context. So it's really critical that we ask victims the right questions, because something may be frightening to the victim, but not to you as the outsider. So we need to ask, what message did that send to you? What meaning did that have to you? What's the story behind that? Tell me more about that, because if we don't ask those questions, we won't understand why the victim's having the reaction that the victim's having. Because those stalking behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. And you all know from the domestic violence cases that you work on, it can be as simple as a song or a lyric or a look, right, that has a meaning. The classic example is a offender saying, I'll send you roses the day I kill you, right? And then the victim receives roses and is terrified, and all the people around that victim are like, oh, that's so sweet, that's so thoughtful, right? So it's that context that's really critical. And again, that context is what criminalizes otherwise non-criminal behaviors. So it can be quite confusing. The truth is that victim fear is an excellent predictor of victim danger, and there's many studies that confirm that. And so if a victim's afraid, there's probably a good reason. That being said, though, many of us just in general in life don't love to admit when we're fearful. That may not be the first word we would use. And when a stalking victim reaches out to you, they're unlikely to say, like, hi, I'm experiencing a course of conduct that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. I believe you call that stalking, right? They're not going to say that. They're going to say something more like, my neighbor's being creepy, my ex has gotten weird, my friend has made things awkward lately, I'm being harassed. Like, so it's the kind of language that you're going to hear. And so it's up to us as responders to be thinking, could this actually be fear? And could this actually be stalking? Because sometimes that fear emotion is masked by other things like annoyance, frustration, anger. I'm sure you work with victims who just seem really angry, and some have no affect at all. And some victims might be minimizing what's going on, so they don't seem very concerned about the situation. So, for example, there was a victim advocate I talked to the other week who said they got a call from a stalking victim. The victim was so happy and said, today's a great day, he's only driven by my house 9 times. And the victim advocate's like, it's 8 in the morning. Like, what are you talking about? And the victim said, oh yeah, but by this point in the day, typically he's driven by like 20 times. And so that victim is not unreasonable, but is responding to this constant traumatic behavior by minimizing what's going on. And so that's where that reasonable person standard is actually quite helpful, because if a reasonable person would say, it's scary that someone drove by your house 9 times by this point in the morning, then that could still be considered stalking, even if the victim's not articulating fear. Now, this isn't to say that victims are not reasonable people, just that they might be minimizing the situation as a result of the trauma they're experiencing. So that standard can actually be really helpful in terms of thinking through fear. And if you could pull up the second half of that video, usually if victims are afraid, there's a good reason. So we're going to try to watch just the second half here. Okay, so in this video, it turns out she had every reason to be afraid, right? And so we don't want to be like that guy going over and saying this is no big deal when actually the fear is very justified. And so just kind of a reminder of that. The thing is, though, we actually hear the word stalking all the time. So that's the behavioral definition. But I hear the word stalking used constantly, just often incorrectly. So you might have heard someone say something to this effect, like, I was totally Facebook stalking you. I saw you went to Mexico. It looked awesome. Does this sound like stalking to you? You can go ahead and type me in the chat box. Does that sound like stalking behavior based on the behavioral definition of stalking? No. No, why not? But everyone's saying no. Good. Context, right? It doesn't create fear. Exactly. Not unless they have a history. No threat is felt. Yes, exactly. You're all 100% on point. This isn't stalking because, assuming these people know each other, right, and are Facebook friends, that's not scary. It's not scary if you post something on social media and a mutual friend sees it, right? That's not scary to a reasonable person. But I hear it used this way all the time, you know, this casual use of the word stalking. And while that doesn't cause stalking, it does create an environment where stalkers are more likely to get away with it because it kind of dilutes the meaning of that term as a serious, traumatic, dangerous crime, right? And it's a little bit unique to stalking. Like, nobody says, oh man, that party was so lit, it's arson. Right? That's not a thing. Like, if someone says, I think there was arson at my home, it's like, oh man, you should call the police, right? But that doesn't go for stalking. It'll be like, well, is he stalking you or is he like stalking you? And so it can kind of create an environment where we're misusing the term, and it affects victims and their ability to identify what's going on as dangerous and their desire to report it and seek help. And it can affect us as responders as well, because we think we know what stalking is and we've heard about it a lot and it's not that big a deal when actually it is. So it can really desensitize us to that. So stalking prevalence and behavior. Stalking is an extremely prevalent crime. In the United States, about 1 in 6 women and more than 1 in 17 men experience stalking at some point in their lifetime. So people of all gender identities can and do experience stalking. Women report it at much higher rates than men do, and the majority of victims report that the offender is male. So when I look up images of stalking, because I'm fun and I do that, these are the kind of results that I'll get. So as you see, there's a lot of kind of shadowy strangers and hoodies and alleys. My favorite's this one in the middle left who's wearing a hoodie and a mask and behind a computer, but is not covering his webcam. Anyway, so you get a lot of these kind of hooded strangers lurking. And I'm sure it won't surprise you all to know that the vast majority of the time, the victim knows the perpetrator. Most of the time, victims and offenders know each other. About half the time overall, it's a current or former intimate partner. And for male victims, it's almost as likely, which are here in the blue, almost as likely to be an acquaintance as an intimate partner. So there is stranger stalking, but it's about 16% overall. The vast majority of victims and offenders know each other. And like I said, again, I expect you all to say, well, of course, you know, because of the work that you do. But when I'm talking about stalking outside of our field, you know, because I'm fun at parties and stuff, people are shocked by this, because when most people think about stalking, they think about celebrity stalkers. They're thinking the Kardashians, they're thinking Taylor Swift, and indeed, our stalking laws do come from a celebrity stalking case. It was Rebecca Schaeffer's murder in the 90s that led to the first stalking law in the country in the state of California. And so that's not wrong, but it is a distancing thing in which some victims will say, oh, it can't be stalking because I know that person, when in fact that's the person who's most likely to pose a threat as a stalker and beyond. So just want to flag that misperception can be a problem for reporting as well. One thing, too, to consider, though, is if about half of victims overall are related to domestic violence, current or former intimate partners, that also means about half of victims are not, right? They're acquaintances, strangers, people of authority like a supervisor, family members. And so I urge you to think about, is your organization serving all victims of stalking, even when those victims are not related to domestic violence? Because unfortunately, there's very few standalone resources for stalking. Typically, our stalking response is housed under our domestic violence response. And that's not wrong, but it is a bit incomplete. Because if I'm being stalked by, say, an old friend or an employer, I may not think to reach out to something called the Family Violence Center, right, or the Women's Shelter, right, even if that's where the response is housed. And it's true for law enforcement as well. Typically, the stalking response is housed under the domestic violence response there, too. So think about, are you serving all victims of stalking? And if so, that's awesome. Would they know how to find you? And if not, okay, where do you refer them? So we actually have a checklist, which is a great activity to do with your organization for Stalking Awareness Month, that asks you questions like that. How do you refer them? Have you had training on this? Is the word stalking on your website? That kind of thing. So I definitely encourage you to do that, to think about your response to stalking. So stalking behaviors, like I said, the behaviors can be quite varied. One thing that we like to point out is that stalkers are, and I don't mean this as a compliment, but they are very creative criminals. Victim advocates and law enforcement always tell me their weirdest, most bizarre, most disturbing cases are stalking cases, because it's someone going so out of their way to do something specific and disturbing that will really get to that one individual. So, like, I recently read a case where an offender drove 500 miles to carve his ex's name in trees near her home. That kind of thing is a stalking case. So if a victim says to you, I know it sounds crazy, but that should definitely make your ears perk up and think, could this be a stalking case? Because a lot of times offenders deliberately engage in behaviors that they know will be hard to prove, or that may not be clear why they're threatening outside the context of that relationship, and they utilize that to get away with that stalking behavior. So again, there's so many behaviors that stalkers use. Unfortunately, this is an acronym to help you remember the different kinds of behaviors. It's by this wonderful researcher, T.K. Logan. And so what we realized was that a lot of times when people think about stalking, they're just thinking about surveillance. And that is often part of a stalking course of conduct, but it's not the whole thing. And so there could be surveillance. So how does that offender watch, track, monitor, gather information about that victim? Life invasion. How does the offender show up in the victim's life where that victim does not want the offender to be there? So the victim's trying to get through their day, and there's the stalker or signs of the stalker no matter what they do. Interference, which is similar, but it's what is the victim losing or afraid of losing as a result of that stalking behavior? What are they actually giving up or having to change in their life? And intimidation. How implicitly or explicitly is that stalker intimidating the victim? So in an in-person session, we do a big brainstorm, and I get to hear from you all about cases you've worked on. And certainly if something here is coming to mind, feel free to type it in the chat box if this is sparking anything in you where you're like, oh yeah, there was that case, and please do share it. But because of the webinar format, I'm going to go ahead and just give you some examples of each. So surveillance, pretty much what it sounds like, and this is not an exhaustive list, just some of the most common techniques here. So that following, watching, waiting, tracking software like the use of GPS, using some kind of spyware in the phone to watch what the victim's doing. Proxy stalking, that means stalking through somebody else. So for example, if there's shared custody and let's say an offender is stalking an ex-partner, and then, saying, oh, is dad seeing anyone new? Is mom taking you on vacation next week? Where are you guys going? That kind of thing. As well as stalking through a coworker. And that can be really invasive, which brings us to our next category, life invasion. Think how scary it is for a victim who's really trying to get away from the stalker, and they arrive at work and the coworker says, oh, guess who I ran into? and they asked about you, right? So they can gather information as well as just be really invasive. So it could be unwanted contact at home, work, etc., phone calls, property invasion. Now, I want to mention that property invasion is a really common stalker tactic, and what a lot of stalkers will do is they'll break into a victim's home or vehicle, and they won't actually break or take anything. They won't steal anything. They'll just leave some sign they were there. So maybe they leave the TV on a channel that they and the victim used to watch together, or they move a lamp or something like that. And so when the victim gets, home or back to their car, they know that the stalker was there, but unless they had some kind of recording device in the home, they can't prove it. And if they call, they're afraid to call the police, or when they do, they say, what am I going to say? The lamp moved, right? I'm going to sound crazy. And that's where that I know it sounds crazy, but comes in, because stalkers utilize that to get away with what they're doing. Public humiliation, so spreading rumors. Way back when I started talking, you might recall you answered those 3 polls about, is this stalking, yes or no? And the second scenario was an ex-partner repeatedly spreads vicious rumors about their ex-partner on social media. And that kind of spreading rumors, humiliation, can actually be stalking. Now, you may say, well, how can spreading rumors be a crime? I mean, people talk, people gossip. But if it would cause a reasonable person fear and is having significant impact on their life, that could be considered a stalking case. So, for example, there was a case where an offender photoshopped and then photoshopped fake nude pornographic images of a victim, made physical print flyers, and distributed them to everyone in her office building and apartment building, along with all these rumors, these lies about what she likes sexually and how to contact her. So that's not just, people gossip, right? That is an intended rumor that could cause real harm, both professional harm, losing time from work, losing opportunities, harm to the reputation, all of that, as well as real violence, right? And so that kind of invasion, and that can be interfering as well, could actually be stalking. Interference, so again, similar to life invasion, but financial and work sabotage. Maybe they're trying to get through their day at work and they have 500 emails from the stalker. It's pretty easy to miss something that they actually needed to respond to. Ruining reputation, like I just mentioned, custody interference, attacking family, friends, pets, all of that can be intimidating and interfering. And last but not least, intimidation. So it could be symbolic, like crushing a soda can or something like that. Threats to harm oneself. That's really, really a high-risk situation in terms of threats to harm that other person. And property damage. So all of that symbolic or actual threats are often part of stalking course of conduct. So because there are so many different behaviors that could be stalking behaviors, I encourage you to, if you're in a place with a victim where you're thinking about charging this, let's say you only have one incident right now, we'd say think about charging stalking, and if you can't charge stalking, or even if you can, think about what other crimes are going on here. So of course it'll depend on your state laws, but these are common crimes that co-occur with stalking and are part of a stalker's course of conduct. So if you have 2 or more, I would argue that at least behaviorally, you have stalking. And so definitely charging, documenting any of these is important, because even if it's a minor misdemeanor or something, you're laying the groundwork so that when the offender does something else, now we have 2 or more, now we have stalking. And I'm happy to look through your criminal codes to see what else might be there, but just again to think broadly and creatively about what that might look like. So stalking, most stalkers engage in multiple behaviors. The most common tactic is that unwanted phone calls and messages. Spreading rumors, also quite common, following or spying, and you can kind of read the list here. And like I said, about 80% are using more than one means of approach. And I would add, too, that a lot of times when we talk about the use of technology to stalk, people might think that that's all that's being used. And while certainly technology can facilitate or enhance a lot of these stalking behaviors, most stalkers who are stalking through technology are also stalking in person, and they're using those to enhance each other. So maybe they're using a GPS device to find a victim, and then they're showing up where they are, or something like that. So most are using more than one means of approach. 2/3 pursue their victim at least once per week. Many pursue daily, and they have plenty of time to change their behaviors because, and this really shocked me when I learned this, the average duration of an intimate partner stalking case, not the high end, the average, is 2 years. And about 10% of cases last 5 years or more. And so these cases can be very long, and offenders have plenty of time to start with one thing. Maybe it's calls and texts. Maybe they disappear for a month, but now they're back showing up, sending gifts, breaking into the home, etc. And so these cases can be long. There are many incidents, and there can be a lot going on here. So many of you I know are coming from an intimate partner violence background. So I'm curious if you can let me know, and Anna, if you can pull up this poll about how often would you say you're working on intimate partner violence or domestic violence cases. Is that, and I know this was up a little bit earlier, is it, and it'll depend on your position, of course, but is that something you're working on daily, weekly, monthly, annually, or rarely? And I'll give you a few seconds to fill that out. Okay, so it looks like over half of you are saying every day, domestic violence cases, and quite a few are saying weekly or monthly as well. Okay, so same question, but how about stalking? How often are you working on those stalking cases? Okay, so as you can see here, the numbers are shifting, right? We're seeing a lot more people saying rarely, annually, maybe monthly. Most people are not saying daily, so it really shifts, and that's really, really typical. So thank you for doing that, and the point I want to make is that, you know, if you're working on intimate partner violence cases, you probably are working on stalking cases. You may just not be identified them that way. So a lot of times in our field, what I'll hear is, you know, oh, it's often a he was abusive, she left, and then he started stalking her. And that can happen, but let's back up for a second. If during the relationship he was following her, tracking her, contacting her constantly, demanding check-ins, talking to her family and friends, gathering information, that's domestic violence, and it is stalking. It is both. And a good percentage of the time, that is happening during the relationship as well, during the relationship or during and after, over half the time. And so it can only begin after a relationship ends, but it can also be part of that emotional abuse, right? Or sometimes I hear the words digital abuse. Let's take a step back and think about that. What is digital abuse? I mean, it's contact, it's all those stalking behaviors that I talked about. So it's domestic violence and it is stalking. And we want to know when our intimate partners are engaging in stalking behavior because on average, intimate partner stalkers pose the greatest risk to their victims. They're most likely to physically approach, be insulting, interfering, and threatening, use weapons, have their behaviors escalate quickly, and to reoffend. There's also a study with women who all had protective orders against abusive partners, and across the board they found that when those partners were also stalking, there was an increased risk for victims from everything from sexual assault to physical assault, emotional abuse across the board. And so basically, in short, intimate partner stalkers are the most dangerous stalkers on average, and intimate partners who stalk are the most dangerous intimate partners on average from the studies that we have. And so we definitely want to be able to identify those behaviors when it's happening during the relationship. In addition to domestic violence, there are so many crimes that can co-occur, and I already mentioned some of them: sexual assault, extortion, vandalism, armed robbery, stalking, all of that. Sometimes offenders are stalking with the intent to commit another crime. So for example, maybe they're following somebody's home, watching the home, trying to figure out when they'll be out so that they can break into the home and steal something, for instance. And so, you know, when you look at any of those crimes, it can be helpful to increase stalking charges to also say, well, what happened before this crime was committed? It might be stalking in addition to whatever that crime was. Sexual violence also co-occurs quite a bit, and there are different ways that can happen. But I want you to think about grooming for sexual violence as stalking. So if you think about a crime of sexual violence, so for example, I'm going to talk about campus sexual assault, okay? But it could be for child pornography, a variety of trafficking, a variety of other crimes. This is essentially the behavior that an offender will engage in. And I'm generalizing here, but they will research and identify vulnerable victims. So they're going to figure out who's vulnerable. So in a college sexual assault example, if you look at the LESAC study of repeat offenders, some of these offenders will look for freshman women who have not had a lot of alcohol experience, right? And then they establish a relationship. They meet them outside of class. They talk to them. They establish how vulnerable they are. They build a sense of trust. And this can happen online as well for someone, for example, a predator of a child victim for sexual exploitation. You know, build that trust, build that relationship. And then they meet in person. So in the college example, it might mean inviting them to a party. It might be picking someone up from school and isolate them, coerce them into those sexual acts, and then contact them after, either to say, thanks for a great time, or you better not tell anyone, or some conflation of the two. And again, I'm generalizing, but essentially that's what grooming for sexual violence looks like. So if you think about that through the lens of stalking, is it a pattern of behavior? Yes. Is it directed at a specific person? Yes. These offenders are researching individuals who they believe are vulnerable to exploit. And would it cause a reasonable person to feel fear? Yes, most people are afraid of sexual violence. Now you may be saying, but when though, right? Because that, you know, freshman woman, for example, may not be afraid on day one. She might be flattered and say, no, I thought it was great that this attractive upperclassman approached me. But now when I look back and realize this entire relationship was a setup for my sexual assault, that's terrifying. So there's no statute that says when fear has to attach in a stalking situation. So even if the victim at first was trusting or enjoying the relationship, if they're looking back and saying it's scary now because it all started with that text, that gift, whatever, that could still be considered stalking. So just something to think about. So I keep saying, you know, hey, domestic violence, that's actually stalking. Digital abuse is stalking. Sexual assault is stalking. You might be saying, like, okay, why do I care, right? Like, I understand that you, Dana, you're like the stalking lady. You're going to tell me everything's stalking, but I'm already doing my work. I don't need to call everything stalking. But it's actually really important. It's not just a matter of, it's not just an intellectual exercise. It's not just a matter of semantics. It has some real practical reasons why it's so essential to name stalking when you see it in your work. The first, which I've mentioned, is that charging and prosecution option. Stalking is really undercharged. Offenders think they can get away with it, and they do, so we want to be charging that more. We can't charge it unless we are identifying it. And it's a great charge for prosecuting because, especially in a domestic violence situation, if a prosecutor is charging domestic violence, that's incident-based, right? So they can talk about an incident of assault. But stalking is the whole pattern of behavior. So if you're a prosecutor working on a domestic violence case, they typically can't bring in that time 2 years ago that the offender stood outside taking pictures of the victim because they'll say, oh, that's prejudicial. You can't bring that in. That's not relevant to this incident of alleged assault. But if they're charging stalking, you can bring in that entire course of conduct. It all becomes relevant because stalking is about that entire pattern of behavior. So it can really paint a much fuller picture of that domestic violence situation. So it's a really powerful charge. It also is typically a higher charge than harassment and some of the other misdemeanors that might make up a stalking crime. And so it's important for those reasons in terms of holding offenders accountable. Also, safety planning. Stalking is its own risk. It requires its own safety planning. When we're, again, especially with intimate partners, if we're seeing, and all stalkers can be dangerous, absolutely. But if we're recognizing stalking within an intimate partner relationship, whether it's current or former, that should be a big red flag that, hey, this could be a really high-risk case, and we need a safety plan around that and think broadly about all those stalking behaviors that might occur and how to make a plan with the victim. As well as victim empowerment. It can be really great for victims to, instead of saying, you know, oh, my neighbor's gotten creepy or my friend's being weird, to be able to actually name what's going on and say, I'm experiencing stalking, and this is a crime, and it's a real thing, and there's resources for that, right? So for all those and more reasons, it's really essential to name stalking when we see it happening. Of course, easier said than done, but we really need everybody on board naming stalking, identifying stalking, and recognizing the risk. We need that education. I saw we had a couple awareness educators in here. We need our general public to understand what stalking is and to know that they should take it really seriously, because we know when most victims report, it's to a friend, not to an authority figure. If that friend says, oh, it's not a big deal, he probably just thinks you're cute, okay, well, that's going to be a problem, right? So we need to educate people on the urgency and reality of stalking, as well as in our field. We need to be educated on it. We need to investigate it. We need our law enforcement to investigate the context, pattern, and mode of stalking. Now, these crimes are challenging because our system's really set up to be incident-based. And what stalking crimes require us to do is take a step back and look at the longer course of conduct. It's more time, it's more energy, it's more resources, but it's really essential to really be figuring out what's going on here. We need to communicate and collaborate across disciplines and jurisdictions. Jurisdictional issues are huge in stalking cases because, you know, in every state has a different stalking statute, and so a lot of time, and most victims don't understand jurisdiction, so, you know, they don't realize, and stalking almost definitionally is about following somebody, right? And so, for example, I live here in D.C. It's really easy to go have a job in Virginia, but then my, you know, new significant other lives in Maryland. Well, that's at least 3 jurisdictions. So a lot of victims say every time they call, it feels like they're reporting it for the first time, because those jurisdictions don't always talk to each other. And so it looks like there's been one incident when actually there's been many, just across jurisdictions. And of course, that prosecution, holding offenders accountable. Just a few safety planning recommendations quickly. When you're responding to victims, you want to advise disengagement from the stalker, and that's because stalkers see any contact as a win. So if a stalker calls a victim, you know, 100 times, and the victim picks up and says, I hate you, stop calling me, tomorrow they're calling 101 times because they saw that as encouragement, and they will continue to persist in this behavior. That being said, disengagement is not always possible or realistic, and we know that, right? So, for example, there was a case where we got a call about it because it was being prosecuted, and it came out the victim had called the offender and talked for hours. And so, of course, the defense is saying, well, how scared could she be? If she's so scared, why'd she call him? When we asked why she called the offender, she said, well, I knew he got off, you know, work at the bar at 2 a.m., so I called him, and I heard him drive home and get into bed and fall asleep, so I knew he wouldn't come over, bang on the door, and wake up my kids again, right? So she's not calling him because she's not afraid. She's calling him because she is afraid, and it's that keep your enemies closer, trying to take the temperature of the situation. And so, again, you want to advise disengagement and let victims know you recognize that may not always be possible, and to safety plan around that and have open communication around that so it's not some kind of secret, right? Documentation is really critical because it's so many different situations, so many different incidents, sometimes across jurisdictions. So we have on our website, and of course, feel free to adapt this, we have it in Spanish as well, the stalking incident log to help victims keep track really succinctly of what's going on. So it's just the date, time, description, location, if there are witnesses, how to contact them, they called the police, what's the report number, and the officer name and badge number. And we know sometimes law enforcement flinches at this a little because when you ask the badge number, they're worried there's going to be a complaint or something. But the reality is that because there's so many jurisdictions and different people that victims might be talking to, it can be really helpful to help connect those dots, because sometimes that Monday group doesn't talk to the weekend group, right? And they don't talk across jurisdictions. And so we don't want victims feeling like every time they called it's the first time. So this can help kind of close some of those loops and connect some of those dots. There is a risk assessment specifically for the crime of stalking. It's available at stalkingrisk.org, and it's really wonderful. It's free, and actually next week at this time, our director, Jen Landheis, will be walking you through this risk assessment using a sample case if you'd like to see it with her. Either way, you can go to the website at stalkingrisk.org, and you can click that you're just testing it out. Most risk assessments are not specific to stalking. They're really about domestic violence and don't necessarily really show that stalking behavior. So this is a really great free tool to utilize. I highly suggest that you check it out for both intimate partner and non-intimate partner stalking cases. It creates a short narrative that can help summarize the stalking situation, as well as some safety planning suggestions. Of course, that doesn't replace the individualized safety plan that a victim would make with a victim advocate, but it's a great starting point to start thinking through some of that. For orders of protection, there's pros and cons. The pro, and typically law enforcement likes an order of protection because now things become arrestable offenses that weren't before. So, the offender drives by the victim's home, that's now easily arrestable. The con, though, is that sometimes the order of protection can escalate that risk to the victim. And so we definitely want to think about that and talk to the victim about what are the pros, what are the cons, and how do they think the offender will react. Some victims will say, oh, the offender will be so embarrassed about this order of protection, they don't want that kind of record, they're going to back off. And sometimes that does happen, and it's really effective, and it's great. And some victims will say, it'll just make them angrier, and I don't want to do that, right? And so you want to ask about that and talk to them about that. Also, order of protection is only as good as the quality of enforcement, and is the victim willing to call the police if the order is violated? And that might sound silly, but a lot of victims don't necessarily realize how these work. Some victims say, no, I wouldn't call the police. Okay, then what gets the order? And we know the violation rates are high. So again, I'm not saying they're good or bad. They can be a really wonderful tool for holding offenders accountable. It's just for thinking through that with the victim and noting some pros and cons. So I can skip ahead here. What we need, which I know is so easier said than done, is that coordination. We need our educators to educate the public on it. We need our victim service providers to recognize stalking and make those safety plans. We need law enforcement holding offenders accountable, charging stalking. We need our prosecutors to take up those charges. We need our courts to really see stalking as a very serious issue, hold offenders accountable. And then we also need our probation and paroles and corrections folks to recognize those stalking behaviors and make sure that it doesn't happen again, because the recidivism rate can be quite high for stalking. And again, I know it's all easier said than done, but it's so critical. So if you have any sort of coordinated community response around domestic violence, I encourage you to think about how is stalking being incorporated into that, and how are we communicating across disciplines, because so often with stalking cases, when we look at one that goes bad, whether it's homicide or something like that, it'll be, well, the advocate knew one piece of information, law enforcement on this side of the state knew something, and a different jurisdiction knew something else, and the prosecutor knew a third thing, and it doesn't quite connect. And then these cases fall through the cracks because our systems aren't really set up for them. So it's up to all of us to sort of be that person who says, hey, let's really get together on this. I'm going to leave you with a few resources, and then I'll stick around after the hour if folks have questions. SPARK is a project of Equitas, which is the prosecutor's resource for violence against women, including stalking. So for working with prosecutors on how best to address these crimes, definitely a wonderful resource there. They're the National Technical Assistance Provider, free 24/7 assistance. Tech safety, we often see technology misused to stalk. So one really great tool is the NADV Tech Safety app. It's free. It describes different kinds of technologies, how they can be misused, how to safety plan around it, how to collect evidence on it. So that's a really great tool, as well as their entire safety net project. There's no national stalking hotline, unfortunately. The closest thing we have is Victim Connect, run out of the National Center for Victims of Crime, and they will refer crime victims, including stalking victims, to the appropriate resource. So, don't have them call Spark, have them call Victim Connect, and they'll help them get to the right place, hopefully, if it's not local. Again, part of this webinar we offer quarterly, and it's in honor of National Stalking Awareness Month. So if you haven't been talking about that at your organization, if you're doing something for Domestic Violence Awareness Month, Sexual Assault Awareness Month, make sure that Stalking Awareness Month is also something that you are promoting. And we have a lot of resources and ideas on our website, which I'm sure will be up soon, fingers crossed, back up soon, that you can share. You can always follow us on social media and share it that way as well. Speaking of which, again, we're on social media, follow us legally. We provide training to all grantees and quote-unquote potential grantees of the Office of Violence Against Women, which includes most universities, law enforcement departments, domestic violence and sexual assault organizations. So if you're thinking, wow, I wish everyone could hear, I wish I could hear Dana talk more and longer about stalking, you might be in luck. So go to our website and request a training. for 2020, and we'll get back to you and come out. We can also do web-based trainings. So I just want to thank you so much for your attention today. I know it's a lot of information in a short period of time. Really appreciate you and all the work that you're doing. You're the ones really out there keeping victims safe, holding offenders accountable. So truly, thank you, thank you, thank you. Feel free to reach out anytime for just some things we offer. Here's my direct email, so feel free to reach out anytime with questions or concerns, and I will stick around if you have any for this to end this webinar with. But again, thanks so much, and have a good rest of your Stalking Awareness Month. And I hope to see some of you next week for Jen Landheis' session. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, but feel free to contact me directly if any arise. Follow us on social media, and yeah, best of luck. Talk to you soon. Bye.